Hi, this is the video lecture on our Introduction to Inequality, the first topic in Unit 3. So we learned in Unit 1 that the sociological perspective often makes you think or see things in a different way. Now, while you may have countered this somewhat in the first two units, I will say that when it comes to Unit 3, you've not experienced anything yet, because Unit 3 is all about inequality, and sociologists tend to take a significantly different view on inequality in our social world as compared to more mainstream society. So before I get to saying or talking about specific concepts that you all read about for this topic, I want to just say a few words. So first, keep in mind as we explore these various systems of inequality that sociologists, including myself, are extremely critical of the status quo. We see the status quo as being built on multiple systems of inequality and oppression. And so because of that, when we look at various pieces of research for the remainder of the semester, you might find yourself encountering inconvenient facts, another term that we looked at in Unit 1. Now, when you come across an inconvenient fact, you may find yourself feeling empowered and enlightened by what we're going to talk about, but others are likely to feel a little bit more dismissive or angry, frustrated, maybe even guilty. What I want to say to you is that all of those emotional reactions are perfectly normal, and trust me, I've seen them all at this point. But I will encourage you to analyze where those feelings are come from, because that's great stuff for sociological analysis. Why you're experiencing a particular reaction says something about our society more generally. So try to distance yourself from those emotions and approach them from a more analytical perspective. Now, I also want to mention that as the semesters progress, we've got to know each other pretty well. There's a lot of interaction built into our classroom, and one of the reasons why I do this is so that you all can feel comfortable with one another. So as we talk about these various types of inequality, as we learn about them and read about them, I want you to feel like this is an open learning environment. So let's get honest with one another. Let's get real. Everyone is going to be given the benefit of the doubt that they're not intending to be offensive with some of the statements that they may contribute to our class. Now, that being said, when we participate in this type of open learning environment, we will encounter moments of uncomfortableness. I'm going to encourage you to embrace that uncomfortableness, to lean into it, because it's ultimately through uncomfortableness that we grow, that we push ourselves beyond our limits. Now, another note to consider, I just kind of want to throw this out there. I consider myself to be a critical sociologist. And what that means is that I identify with and see myself as an ally for marginalized groups. So this is something that to be honest, I am unapologetic about. This is my orientation. This is the lens through which I see the world. And I wanted to bring this to your attention for the sake of transparency. I don't want anybody to think that I'm trying to pull the wool over their eyes, so to speak. This is my role as a sociologist, as a teacher, and as a researcher. Now, that being said, in order to do well in the class, you do not have to take an all things sociology oath at the end of the class. You do not have to pledge to uphold all things sociology. You certainly need to know the sociological perspective on inequality, but you don't have to personally adopt it as your own. I welcome all reactions to what we'll be talking about for the rest of this semester, whether they be in support or more critical of the material. Okay, so there's that spill, introducing us to Unit 3. Now I want to very briefly hit on some of the key concepts covered in the readings assigned for this topic, beginning with the concept of intersectionality. So essentially, this perspective suggests that people experience the categories they occupy, that people don't experience the categories they occupy in a segmented fashion. They experience them simultaneously. It's the idea that the various social dimensions that we occupy, such as our gender, our race, our class, our sexual orientation, our religious affiliation, and on and on and on, right? So those social dimensions intersect with one another to influence our identities, our behaviors, our interactions, and how social institutions perceive us. So it's problematic to speak of the woman's experience or the Black experience because these categories interact with others. A great example of where you see a lack of intersectionality in a lot of the times relates to this idea that women entered the workforce in the 1970s. Some of you are probably familiar with this trend, learned about it in your high school and college history classes. Again, the idea being that in the 1970s, women in the U.S. began to enter the workforce. Well, really, when you look at the patterns, when you look at the data, it was white middle-class women who were entering the workforce in the 1970s. Women of color and working class women have always been a part of the workforce in a variety of capacities. And so to say that women entered the workforce in 1970s is not only inaccurate, it also ignores the history of other women. Something else you're going to read about, or you have already read about, are the distinctions that we should make between differences and inequality. So there are obviously differences between groups. These differences aren't going away, and in a lot of ways we really wouldn't want them to, right? They give life richness and help us form a unique identity. However, when some groups are given greater access to resources, both material and non-material, then these differences between groups have an aspect of inequality associated with them. And it's that inequality we're going to be unpacking this semester. Now, I want to spend a bit of time talking about the concept of false parallels that you read about. So from a sociological perspective, it is important to consider history, context, and power dynamics when thinking about inequality. So we have narratives in our society that suggest that dominant groups such as men and or whites are oppressed in similar ways compared to marginalized groups. Now, these discourses would be considered false parallels from a sociological perspective. Now, this isn't to suggest that some inequalities are okay and others are bad. Inequality and oppression, no matter the form it takes or when it happens, is problematic and should be questioned. It does, however, suggest that the context in which some acts of inequality occur and the consequences associated with them are important to consider. So Schwabe's example of sexual objectification helps to illustrate this concept very well. So he explains that men sexually objectifying women is different than women sexually objectifying men because men do it more often than do women. It's a part of how masculinity is socially constructed in the U.S. In our society, learning to be a man often involves learning how to view and treat women as sexual objects. And then also historically and contemporarily, men have more power both physically and economically. So women at the aggregate level do not have the same power, and thus the consequences of their sexual objectification of men are much different. Now, The last reading in this unit describes the concept of hegemony. It's a short reading, but it's pretty dense. The main takeaway is that hegemony works as an ideology to maintain power imbalances we see in society. An ideology simply refers to a belief system. So hegemonic ideology then is a set of beliefs that explain the social world we're surrounded by, and in particular the inequality that we see. Now, with each different type of inequality we examine, class, race, and gender, we'll be talking about the hegemonic ideology associated with it. Okay, that's all that I have for now by way of an introduction to inequality. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know. Have a great day.